Welcome to the True Sight podcast by Oracle's Elixir, your source for in-depth analytical coverage of professional League of Legends and the rest of the esports world. I'm Tim Magic Sevenhusen, and today I'm joined again by coach and content creator Kelsey Moser. Welcome back to the show, Kelsey. Happy New Year.
Hello. Happy New Year. It's great to be back on the show. This is my second appearance. I can now say that I've been on your show more than Damon, maybe.
You've been
have no
on this
idea.
show more than literally anyone else. You are the first repeat guest,
Nice.
at least since the relaunch of the show, because like years ago I ran a show with this title, but it was like 20 to
Yeah, but
25-minute interviews. And so
I
this
was
is,
on that as well, so it's
you're probably
really
still
hard to
leading it.
argue. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we're getting close to the start of the competitive year. We have wrapped up kind of the off-season stuff, Demacia Cup, Kespa Cup, things like that. We're getting into, I believe the next patch is officially the first Season 11 patch. So it's all coming together. And I'm just looking forward to talking about, I've been doing all kinds of content about off-season stuff and previewing the year
Mhm.
and all of that. Looking forward to talking about a lot of that stuff. But I'm also just really excited that soon we're going to get to start talking about actual results. And one of the first places we're going to get to do that is in the NA amateur scene, which has this whole new format. I've done lots of content covering what the format's going to be, what the changes are to the structure of it, why they did those. But it's going to actually start happening soon. The first tournament, I believe, is this weekend with Risen Esports. They've been running some qualifiers. The actual tournament kicks off, I believe, this weekend. So I know that you pay really close attention to the amateur scene. You have as an academy coach. Of course, that was pretty important to you, scouting players, bringing them up. How are you feeling about this first tournament coming up? Do you think it's going to be like a really good intro to the year, or is it going to be kind of the slow start? What's it going to look like?
Yeah, so Risen has always been one of the major ones, right? So they're coming back. As a result, you'll see a lot of the teams already know to apply to that one. So you'll have a lot of really good quality teams, generally medium quality teams, and the full range of hardly master to to high challenger, right? And then we're already seeing like teams like 100X be in that tournament, C9 Amateur. So we'll get to see a lot of these initial uh, big and Evil Geniuses Prodigies, the new roster. So there's just going to be a lot of the big teams that people are excited about already in the event. So I think that that's going to be probably one of the highlights of the season compared to some of the other tier two tournaments. And then just really we'll get our first feeling of how these teams are doing at the start of the season, because obviously it's a very long season. We basically have a season of amateur, academy, and LCS, and I think there's going to be 3 splits of amateur. So it'll still have the split format in amateur, but it'll be a fun time for sure.
Are there any specific teams that are like the ones to watch from your perspective? Like you called out the LCS affiliated ones. I think you're definitely going to want to watch the LCS affiliated ones. But beyond that, I think like Anu is probably the organization that has jumped out to me the most as like, hey, they've got some really good players here. And I'm trying to connect the solo queue names with some of the actual player names because
Sure.
I have the
Yeah.
rosters listed here by solo queue. But Anu is what they got. Anda, they've got Five Fire, Value, Big is that support, I
Yeah,
think,
big.
and then top
Yeah, so
lane.
everyone on their team has had some previous academy experience. And
Yeah,
top
who's their
lane
top laner?
is wow.
we have
Actually,
to we have
I'm
to try to
really
remember.
blanking
Here,
on
we'll frantically look it up. You
Viper,
tell me about the other
Viper.
ones.
It's Viper.
Viper. Oh yeah,
It's
of
Viper.
course. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I just remembered.
playing under the solo queue
Yeah,
name.
it's
Hate it
Viper.
here, as if he's like a European import. I first saw that solo queue name and I thought it's gonna be like Perks or somebody trolling. Like, oh, I
No,
hate
no,
it here.
no.
And then
The most American thing. He's Canadian, maybe. Actually, I don't know. But the I do know the most American thing, whether you're Canadian or American, is to hate where you are. So that you have that going for you. I think that there's no way he's European with a name hated here. It's always going to be Canadian American.
fair enough.
Yeah, so I think that team's exciting. Another team that people are interested in is Barrage.
Hmm.
They have Fnatic from Fly Academy, so that's pretty cool.
Yep.
And then basically they have a lot of the favorites like always plan ahead, the Winter, Fight Geek Lord, running it back again. Then you have another other rosters with Aloran, people know from a new Ablaze, right?
Hmm.
And they have Aloran and then my boy Breezy, making an appearance. So
Hmm.
uh, a lot of those pretty obvious ones. I think if people are wanting to come up with even more names, you've got Sign Us Please, who they haven't gotten an org yet, right?
Apparently.
They have Eclipse or Boris, who almost joined C9 Academy last year. Guy, SPMFX, a few names that you might recognize from in-houses, CP Freeze. And then you have your Super Sunshine Fruit Basket Warriors, the branding sensation themselves, with
the
Eyla.
the Oracle's Elixir Discord has been loving that team name.
Yeah. So all the favorites are going in here. I think that you've got, I don't know if this has been announced yet, so I won't say, but I will say that a team to watch is the Mirage roster, which has Dragoon, DNA, Meech, just a lot of. I think there are reasons to watch like almost every team in this list. Let me see if there's one that's really, really obvious that I'm missing here.
Yeah, like there are definitely a lot of teams to like. I'm sure, it most likely these are the ones that are going to progress to like the top 8 of the tournament and so on. I'd say it's the top 8 onwards is going to be like every team is worth watching. But this is
Yep.
seems to be a tournament with a lot of teams involved, which is exciting to see. Gives you a lot of opportunity to watch. If you had to pick
Yeah, I think.
like finalists, who do you think is most
Oh,
likely to?
finalists.
Yeah.
I mean, you always have the teams with the experienced players do really well in amateur, and I think that that'll remain the case for a while. I was talking to someone about this recently. The question was, do you think that teams with a lot of ex LCS or academy players that have been around for a while should be an amateur? And I said, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that this is the place where they can go. They're not really denying spots from people because most of these amateur orgs aren't super well resourced, right? They don't have a lot of funding. I think that's changing a bit. We're actually seeing orgs with actual salaries, but I don't think that these organizations are really heavily denying the development of players. And obviously, they have, if they're not affiliated with an LCS org, their main interest is in winning, right? When this is the highest league they can compete in, so they're going to pick experienced players. And it's really down to the infrastructure of other organizations, of coaches to help level up rookies, so that these players don't win everything. But I think that until then, they're just going to win everything. And I don't think that that's wrong. I think that they definitely have a place here. If they aren't able to win amateur, then they shouldn't compete in amateur, right?
Yeah.
But they definitely can. There's a lot of really talented players on the new. Obviously, I think you have Five Fire on the, like, these players are looked strong in academy, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
strong academy prospects. So there's no reason to say that these guys shouldn't be there. And I think that they'll probably do very well and make the finals. Let's see.
Yeah.
I also
I've
think.
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I
Okay.
was going to say another one, but if you have another one in mind, we can go
Yeah.
ahead.
No. I was just gonna say like in general, I think I've heard the take that
Mhm.
players might want to avoid, like players who have had LCS experience or a lot of academy experience, might want to avoid amateur because it kind of feels like the downside is a lot higher than the upside in the sense that if they don't win a lot, they could just straight up end their career. And I've heard that take. It's one I don't really subscribe to myself because, yes, I understand that if a player comes in, let's say like Anda comes in and he doesn't look like one of the very best junglers in amateur, then that might be kind of the end of it for him. 6 months of that, and maybe you never have another chance again. On the other hand, I think like if you can't prove it, that like your career has to end sometime. You got to try your best. Like you can't just sit around for 6 months playing solo queue and hope that gets you back in. Because I think that has worked more in the past, but I think that that has to change, and it is changing. That the players who are actually out there trying and winning at the amateur level are going to get priority over the guys who we remember them from 6 months ago and they were good. Like, hey, Sneaky played a year ago and he was, we had a certain sense of him then, and we'll just bring him back and it'll still be the same. Like, you got to keep demonstrating it, I think.
I have a. I definitely have an opinion on this one. I think that honestly, right now, probably still the best way to get noticed by orgs is just to climb high on solo queue. you see a lot of players who just are consistently winning amateur, and organizations know that okay, they're basically just able to flex their existing competitive experience on players that don't really understand really basic fundamentals in the context of amateur, don't understand laning fundamentals, micro fundamentals, pretty much any type of fundamentals, right? There's a really significant gap between some of the more experienced teams and the like even the second tier of experience. So I think that that's something that's very obvious there, and then orgs are still less interested in the teams that win amateur. So for me, I just think that there's not necessarily the level of scouting that cares that much about the players that have been through academy and gone through amateur again, but you still can get a second chance going through that system. You have Shoryu, players like that. But I think again, like
Auto.
the fact that they were able to go to scouting grounds,
Mhm.
that was probably a more significant factor than them being able to just do well in amateur.
which
And then
which
you,
is really unfortunate, right?
yeah,
Like scout
mm-hmm.
if you watch Scouting Grounds and it makes you think about a player that has been playing amateur for 6 months and you didn't trigger to that player from amateur, like Scouting Grounds should not be the one that's suddenly like, oh, this player, like that's not.
Yeah,
It kind of does. It kind of is intended for that, but it really shouldn't be.
yeah. I think the idea and the intention from Riot is that the amateur circuit is going to displace scouting grounds and make it kind of obsolete. And so this will be where teams are doing more of their scouting in the future. But right now, I don't think it's quite there yet. So probably if I was giving advice to a player right now, I would not necessarily recommend that they join an amateur team. I would say, get get the highest, get rank one on the ladder as high as you can go. I think honestly, it's done a lot for players like Revenge, who got picked
Mhm.
up by LCS rosters to be just really high on the ladder. I mean, I think it did something to an extent for Max Soligo as well. I think this guy is really criminally underrated, but he managed to hit rank one in solo queue, and I think that that probably contributed to Dig giving him a look. So I think that that's still kind of be the best way to get your brand out there to get information going. But I also think that players like Shoryu succeeding, that this is maybe a success story there. At the same time, I don't think people are going to give Winter another look. I remember when Winter almost went to scouting grounds last year, right? He qualified again, and he specifically said, if anyone wants to look at me, I will go. If no one says anything, then I will cede my spot. And none of the orgs showed any interest in him. So I think that there's some players who are actually just competing in amateur because they love the competition. This is as high as they can go. That doesn't mean that they should stop competing, right? If they
Mhm.
still love it, if they still love the game, then that's really exciting for them. I wish that, I mean, some players just aren't going to get another chance in academy, and I think that they're aware of who they are, and the players that aren't aware of who they are and that there's still a shot to make a name for themselves in amateur, so they're competing for that reason. There's probably a lot of different reasons to compete in amateur, and I don't necessarily think we're quite there where this is where we're going to scout most of our talents, but hopefully that's the eventual goal.
Yeah, I think definitely we're entering this like transition period, right? Where right now
Mhm.
amateur might not be, the place that you pick up these players that are going to be your next academy roster, but that is definitely the goal. And a year from now, hopefully, we're closer to that being more of the what actually is happening. And that's definitely what this structure is being designed to work towards, with the ability to go in and beat some academy teams and say, hey, look, we're better than what you have in academy. You should be looking at us. And maybe that changes what they do in academy next year. Maybe they actually make some changes during the year. Because that's another aspect of the structure of amateur this year is you can only have a contract that lasts up to the end of the current year. You can't be Cloud9 amateur and hold on to this player and say, oh, but we don't have an academy spot for you next year, so we're just going to keep you until 2022 amateur. No, you're going to lose that contract with them no matter what. So you have to promote them in season if you want to hold on to them. So that's something where we may see. I think amateur
Yep.
always is going to have a lot more roster volatility than LCS or academy, but especially with that, it encourages the LCS teams. You got to move these guys up, mid year.
Yeah, and I think you did a video on it a while ago about talking about what did 100 Thieves actually get out of the next program. A lot of it was branding factoring in, right? So I think that there's been feedback from certain LCS orgs that right now there's just not an incentive to get into amateur just because you don't have a lot of coaching protection. So I think that that's the also kind of the downside there. But I also think that that's a personally I think that that's a very weird and narrow way to look at it because if you do get a really good player, then most likely that player is going to be incentivized to stay with the org, right? You're the first org
Mm-hmm.
that signed them. You manage to invest a lot of time and energy and resources to them. They might get a really big offer from C9, but generally speaking, if you're willing to match that offer, they might feel more incentivized to stay with you guys. So that's kind of a backwards way of thinking about it, I think. And
Yeah,
obviously, a lot of people like I understand the organizational perspective, but I also really think it's so. Just to be frank, I can say that now. I think that that's like a terrible way to think about
if
amateur.
I think it's relevant on the LCS level too, right? Because even a 3 year, the maximum LCS contract is 3 years, and even that is not
Mm-hmm.
that long if you want to make a player the core of your team for the long term, right? Like it's pretty long term, but even so, and
It's
and
pretty
it's
long
relevant
term,
to a
yeah.
team.
I think 3 year contracts are really long
Sure,
and
sure,
shouldn't
sure,
exist. But that's my
but
opinion, yeah.
like let's say you're looking at someone like Johnson with Dignitas, and they sold his contract off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons for that, at least from the outside, is he had one more year left in his contract, and they're concerned like we're not going to win this year, and he'll just walk at the end of this year. We need to get some value back for him and at least get, sell him for some money right now. But the goal should be, and I'm not saying Dignitas wasn't in the right place to fulfill this goal, but the goal should be you make them like your organization and develop enough brand loyalty that you can retain them anyways. And whether it's just because he likes Dignitas or because the rest of the roster you're building around him is good enough that he commits to staying, like Jensen and Team Liquid, right? Like, and that's not maybe the best example because Team Liquid probably could outbid anybody else who wanted to try to get Jensen away from them. But you say, hey, look, Jensen, re-sign with us because look
Sure,
what else
yeah.
our team is like, and you are already with us, and you know us, and you know that we are committed to you. Like, you want to bring them back, and so the goal if you're Dignitas with Johnson is you want to show the reasons why he should stay with you, and that way you don't have to sell him in that last year of his contract. But there are a lot of other pieces of context around that, of course.
Yeah, yeah,
So
of course.
yeah,
The other perspective is there's no reason to think that Dignitas could build a roster that could compete with Team Liquid or Cloud9. So if
yeah,
Johnson gets an offer from Team Liquid or Cloud9, Johnson is probably going to say, my career is really short.
mm,
Unless you guys are going to pay me a lot of money, I'm going, right? You have to pay more than these other organizations to retain players. And since Dignitas, again, is one of those organizations with the basketball backing, they probably don't really have that in the cards. The other factor to I get where the orgs are coming from that perspective, but in terms of amateur players, um, yeah, there's a lot of stuff like this, but I think in terms of amateur players, I think most of them are just at this point wants to be part of an amateur team for an LCS org and wants to have that allow them to transition into academy. And I
mm,
think there are a lot of weird issues with the new format again as well, because if you're an academy player, let's say you just got picked up in scouting grounds as a really, really high tier prospect, and obviously a lot of teams have pre-agreements with some of these players in scouting grounds, right? So the draft is
let's
kind of
not talk about that.
it's kind of a joke anyway. But let's say that right the last place org drafts like the highest prospect player, and then they aren't able to build good academy pieces around them, and then that player loses to amateur players in the amateur circuit, then theoretically their career ends before it begins, right? So there's like a lot of weird nuances just because of the lack of good development resources to every single team. But I think in general, if you are an org with at least kind of middle tier resources, there isn't necessarily a reason to not have an amateur program unless you just can't afford one. Most of them are really cheap. But unless you just can't afford them or you have like zero resources to actually help develop those players
Yeah,
and to make them feel a sense of loyalty and gratitude for, oh, okay, you made me academy ready. I'm going to stick with your org for academy, and I think we can really win this.
yeah, and I think like I've had the conversation separately with Golden Guardians management about what they aren't going to be running amateur, and it is on that cost side. But they also, from what I understand, again from the outside, they are in a bit of a special circumstance where their company policy from the very top is we'd have to pay these people as full-time employees and give them benefits and all that, which just for them themselves, it inflates their costs for running this team. But other orgs might not have those same kind of guidelines or restrictions. So for them, it might be a lot cheaper to run an amateur team. So you do get some of these special cases that you have to work around. I think, going back a moment to the point you were making about, drafting a player out of scouting grounds and, hoping to build a good enough academy team around him. I mean, the specific scenario is Tony Top gets drafted by Immortals, right? Doesn't sign with them, signs with EG Academy, and finally EG announced their academy roster. What do you think of this? So they have Tony Top. They picked up contracts from 100 Thieves. They have Jojo Pyun, Shoryu, and Mystiques importing from Europe. How do you feel about that academy roster they put together?
I think Contracts is ridiculously underrated. Should be on an LCS team. There are reasons for that I'm not going to get into right now, but for sure, this is really huge for him to be part of their roster. I think Mystiques and him make a good core that I can see functioning well. And Jojo Pyun is really insane. I think a lot of people won't recognize him, but he's very. If you've watched any of his solo queue, he's very good on the ladder. He has a sort of similar story to Poome, in that he came from another game, spent a little bit of time really dedicating himself to bringing himself up in the league. My main concern for Jojo Pyun is that he is very young. He's probably the youngest player in Academy. And I am always really hesitant to advise players who are 16 to go into Academy or full-time esports, because if their schooling suffers, there's not really a good fallback.
Yeah.
Right? For that sort of situation. So that's my main concern with a pickup, is just making sure that he's able to balance getting his high school degree and also competing in academy.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms, obviously, I think it was announced that Shiden was originally going to be their jungler, right? But he was.
I'm not sure if that was announced.
I at least saw it on the Reddit.
I think a lot of people have been talking about that and assuming it was the case, at least.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
But he had a competitive ban for, behavioral check stuff.
Yeah, and I think that more credence to that rumor was that they were friends, right? Shiden and Jojo Pyun.
Okay.
So I think that lines more. That's another reason why people think that. But I think that he'll benefit from having a more experienced player like Contracts. Contracts actually developed a lot in terms of becoming a good leader this year on 100 Thieves Academy and then on 100 Thieves. So I think that's going to be for him. He can easily grind really hard and compete for LCS again. And then top lane, Tony Top. So Tony Top and Shoryu, I probably have a more controversial opinion on. I think Shoryu understands spacing well enough that he can do consistent DPS in fights, but his mechanical ceiling isn't as high as some of the other ADs. And then Tony Top, honestly, really mixed bag. I think that he has a lot of promise. He was always kind of the last person on my if I need to replace Fake God list, right? But he also has, I think, a lot of hit or miss games. He doesn't have the high highs of someone like Miles when you see him play, but he maybe has slightly more consistency. And then his champion pool is really interesting too. But I can see him develop well, but I don't see as much promise in him as some of the other rookie tops in Academy right now.
Yeah, it seems to me overall that they balanced out their roster really well for the goal of developing some players into LCS players in the future, because they brought in, I think, having Tony Top and having Jojo as people who have really low levels of competitive experience, and more the profile of high potential, low experience. It's going to be a project, right, to get them there. They have Contracts and Mystiques who have both played quite a bit, but are still, these are not just you're just going to be the veterans in Academy and all you're here for is to train up the next guys. No, these are guys who could also compete, I think. Mystiques maybe a little less so than Contracts, but they could compete to try to become, to try to take over some LCS jobs. And the Shorio is a little bit in the middle for me because he has been around a little bit and he's been up and down a bit. And he's less of the unknown, let's unlock some hidden potential in this, but he is a little still on that front. And so there's a really, like, it's not the roster that's going to come in and say, we're going to win Academy. I mean, maybe, but it's really about, like, we've got 2 or 3 players who we could develop really well, and we've got really good pieces around them to win enough to help them develop and to be examples to them and help them grow.
Yeah,
So I think they've balanced it out super well.
It's definitely the kind of roster that appeals to me as an ex-Academy coach, right? It's a roster full of players that are interesting projects, have a lot of upside. There's no one on that roster that I think, you can't make LCS, right? So I actually like the Academy roster quite a bit. But yeah, I definitely have a few question marks just on Tony Top and Shoryu in terms of their overall heights compared to some of the other top laners, but I don't think that they really struck out in any role. There's no one on the team where it's like, okay, well, they at the last minute couldn't find a good player in this position, right? Which is pretty impressive if the rumors about Shaden are true. Yeah.
Yeah, and then another org that also just announced their Academy roster, and the other one that we've been waiting on these 2 orgs for a long time to finish off the full set of Academy players is Dignitas. And they've got a fairly different balance, but one that I still feel personally pretty good about overall, especially given the circumstances and how late in the offseason they had to actually start putting this thing together, from what I understand. So they ended up announcing Lorlo, Acadian, Yusui, Spawn, and JJ. So Spawn's going to be, the brand new rookie here. Yusui's been around Academy for a long time, had, a half dozen games in LCS and then got sent back down, has been, arguably one of the best mid laners in Academy for a long time, but never really broken through. And then, of course, you have Lorlo, Katie, and JJ, who are all, like, big-time veteran, been around forever. And that's much more weighted towards the experience and mentorship kind of angle, or potentially even, if the LCS starters flop, we're going to take your jobs. What do you think of the balance they managed to strike?
I like this roster less. I will just be upfront about it. I don't really think that JJ is the right support to have behind Aftermove, but I do also understand that you support is not the deepest role in North America. So I appreciate that they're still like going for a native supports, but I wouldn't go for JJ, right? I think there are other options that you can kind of take a risk on. And then you have Spawn, who I think everyone agrees is really talented, but I do think that my main takeaway from him is just he's going to have like an uphill battle on the personality side in terms of his ability to really have that killer instinct that's going to take him far. And then I also see him as like it's also strange to me that if they're going to have this roster set up where they have like a more veteran top laner behind the player like Fake God, right? As a backup plan, then having like Spawn behind Asta feels weird. So again, I'm assuming just because like AD and support are some of the less deep roles in NA that they just couldn't like round out those rosters with picks that made sense in terms of their strategy. I think a lot of people are looking at this and thinking that Yusui should start over Soligo. Obviously, I'm biased, but I think that the big thing about Yusui is that his laning fundamentals are really poor. He basically gets advantages by cheesing his lanes, cheesing his 1v1s, right? So he doesn't quite like have the level of consistency, I think, that will make him succeed in an LCS mid laner. And I think that he'll kind of fall behind in lane against a lot of the teams if he is put in LCS. But I think Yusui and Soligo are a really interesting duo to have on the same team, right? So that's something that people pointed out. Like I've always kind of in my head thought that they're 2 different options, right? I think that Yusui has a lot of upside in terms of the plays that he goes for that are really interesting, whereas Soligo plays like front to back, team fights really mechanically well, understands laning fundamentals, and can play like that type of mage style. So they're 2 very different players. So I think that is an appealing situation. Acadian behind Dardoch, I can see why Acadian would be the pick that you go for, right? This part of the strategy, so like mid jungle strategy makes some sense. I think having like a more stable jungler behind Dardoch is always going to be the strategy that you go for with whenever you have Dardoch. I don't think that Acadian is going to be like a good leader or fill that role well. Have the kind of experience to say this is the play that I'm going to make and everyone's going to follow through as much. Maybe he's gained that on Dignitas in the past year or so. But he's like definitely going to need more work, and then and obviously I can say this that Fake Guns League are very used to having their junglers like make plans, right, and playing off of that. So I can see that being a weird adjustment. I know that there were some other junglers that were available when they signed Acadian, so he wasn't my first choice, but I understand like the I don't think the pickup is bad. And then Lorlo, I don't get
Okay.
at all. But that's like I think a lot of people think that Lorlo is pretty strong in Academy and have said that he does really well. But if you kind of watch the picks that he played, it was like Ornn or Aatrox, right? And then he would do pretty decent on those, and he would get set up well by his jungler and his team in that context. I think we've seen him a lot in LCS, and his peaks are like maybe mid tier top laner, right? That's like kind of his peaks. So the fact that he's consistently still on academy teams is one of the bigger head scratchers for me. Especially since I think top is actually a pretty deep pool in NA in terms of talent.
Yeah. See, I think Lorlo for me was a lot better in spring than he was in summer. And if you had like cut off the year at the end of spring and said we're going to put him in Dig Academy for 2021, that would fit a lot more for me. But in summer, he definitely dropped off and didn't look as good. And I think to some extent, like at a very high level oversimplification, like he had Demande on his team in spring and not in summer. Maybe that has something to do with it, and some other things like that. But that is one where like a lot of these, not a lot, but a couple of these players that Dig brought in, you do wonder whether it's because other choices they might have picked up in front of him weren't available by the time they were able to start going after their academy lineup.
I'm pretty sure they decided they were going to keep Lorlo very early on in the offseason because they brought him to Scouting Grounds as a coach as well. So that's a pretty clear indication that you're committed to a player. Their team was winning, but I never saw a fight where it's like, damn, Lorlo played that so well. He's such a good top laner, right? I never had that thought. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, I get that that he's going to provide some consistency and some veteranship, but if you're building most of your roster with that supposition in academy, then it feels really awkward, especially if you're an org that is kind of saying, we're already not necessarily aiming for worlds. We probably can get playoffs at the best, right, on an LCS level. And I think that their LCS roster is pretty underrated. Like, I know you rated them 9th or something, and I think that that's wrong, but, that's my opinion. But I think that if they're already kind of saying, we're not going to hit the upper echelon, then having, like, stable players in academy doesn't make that much sense to me, right? If you're already thinking that at best we make playoffs, then why would you not just double down on more bets in your academy roster? So I guess that's one of my biggest question marks in terms of like how Dig is put together on the academy side. But I guess we'll see how it all plays together. I don't see this team doing particularly well in academy. This looks like kind of a mid-tier academy team, in my opinion, which is not what you want if you're doubling down on having like veterans in your infrastructure. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I think like in a perfect world, you would want one more rookie or development project in this lineup. But as it is, I think the profile of this academy team is very much help Spawn become LCS ready. that's pretty much what it seems to be oriented towards, in my opinion. And then a little bit of backup. A little bit of backup to get into LCS, but
it's really weird to me, right? Because I watched both of them, right? Like I watched both Spawn and Asta in off season, and went back and reviewed their games, how they played in general, and I felt like Spawn had some really good instances where he spaced really well on Ashe, but in general, I didn't think that he was too insane. And I'm not just basing this off of his Scouting Grounds games because that would be unfair, but also just some of the games that he played in amateur as well. Yeah, and I was actually really pleasantly surprised by Asta when I gave him a
Hmm.
second look. I guess he's Neo again now.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
renamed again. I was actually really pleasantly surprised by how he was playing his fights, and I thought his biggest overhead was just going to be on laning fundamentals
yeah.
in general. So, like, I think that that's a really big overhead for him, but spawns is even worse. So, for me, it was just kind of weird that they're going for, like, we're going to develop spawn to be LCS ready when we already have Asta, but then we're also going to put these veterans behind these rookies, and I just didn't see a consistent logic behind the building of their academy roster. Like, there wasn't really a consistent decision behind the players that they chose for each position.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think they aren't the worst academy team that I think has been put together in terms of like vision and
Yeah,
purpose and potential, but also not the best. I will
which
say that
arguably they were last year, so that's this year, so that's an improvement. Arguably, they were like the worst logically put together academy team in 2020, so I'm glad that they aren't in 2021.
they managed to sell Demonte, and that was a win. I have a different opinion on who had the least well put together academy run in 2020, but we won't worry about it.
Uh,
I'm pretty sure I've said it before.
100 Thieves? Okay. Nice.
Well, it was just the 100 Thieves coaching staff that was a problem. That was all. On
Yeah,
the rest of the academy side,
same. I thought their academy coach was really terrible.
um, for the rest of academy, are there certain players that people should be especially looking for? That I think academy overall, I think we could say is like going to be a lot stronger and more competitive with a little bit higher volume of veterans in some cases, also a bunch of oceanic imports. Um, who would you really be watching for? I assume like we have names like Kenby and Tenacity who people are like getting hyped of because of 100 Thieves Next as partly, but what else is on your list?
Let's see if I can pick a player that I don't hear people talking about that often.
We've got, imports like Eyla, who's coming in as the Oceanic MVP,
Mhm.
right? Um,
So, yeah, I think Ayla is a really interesting one because he's someone I watched a lot in the off season, just trying to get familiar with Oceanic players. And there's always this idea that Ayla's been around for a little while, in the context of OPL, but he's actually really good. Like I think he and Isles both can play LCS by the end of the year. But they theoretically, obviously, Ayla's on TL, so it's very unlikely to happen. But both of these players can potentially like play LCS by the end of the year or be good LCS supports. And again, I don't think that the support pool in NA is too great, so
yeah.
that's not the most outstanding statement. But I think Ayla actually is pretty creative and smart about how he sets things up. I think Isles is a bit better, but it's kind of a mystery to me that he hasn't seen a lot of good consistency. I tried to get references on him from his ex coaches, and I won't. Like if they're really good or they're really bad, right? That sets up a really weird expectation. So I don't know. It's just interesting to me that he's been consistently like one of the best supports on OS. I thought he was better, like he played better than Destiny last year because I also scouted him last year. So it'll be interesting to see for sure, like how he does in the context of NA. Maybe this is like a brand new setting, a new leaf, and he'll just really pop off and do really well. So I
Yeah,
think Giles is better
definitely.
than Ayla, though. I'm looking
Yeah.
at your notes,
Well, a lot of
but I do
people,
think Giles is better.
yeah, a lot of people are back and forth on those ones, and I don't have a strong opinion on either of them. I
Mhm.
haven't gone and specifically scouted either of those players, but I've definitely seen several people say, "Hey, why is Isles, getting into LCS with he's starting for Immortals, right? Or no, Destiny is. Where's Isles? Where's Isles playing? Oh, Cloud9 Academy, of course. Which feels like LCS sometimes with the reputation C9A has been able to build up. People, I think there were rumors of certain LCS teams that he was going to play with, and a lot of other people coming in and saying, no, Ayla's better, he's the one who won MVP and all this. And, to hear takes on the other side just, I think, validates that, it is possible to feel like Isles was the better player of the two. But yeah, I think there are some NA supports that I think are definitely worth highlighting, even though we've had a really big like Mystiques and Dreams are coming in as imports, and players like the Isles and Ayla. But you've got Poome, who had some LCS time. and is now going to be playing Academy because he got supplanted by Huhi and that whole import. Um,
Yep.
and you've got Chime, I think, who I've been pretty excited about with Golden Guardians and the investment that they're putting into him, especially because he's going to be playing with Prismal, who I was really interested in coming out of Academy last year and thought he was somebody that could be considered, maybe a little bit on the fringe, but could be considered if you're making a project at your LCS bot lane position. So the Prismal Chime bot lane, is that one you have a lot of thoughts about?
Yeah, I like both of these players a lot. I think they're obviously very good. I think, or at least have very good ceiling for different reasons. I think Prismal, he's a really interesting player because he gets like super high fee, right? And his positioning will like sometimes he'll like ignore threats to get a good position, and he's still working on the execution and some of the visualization of that. Chime, I think, still inting quite a bit, but I'd rather have a support that ints, than that doesn't try. I always am
Yeah.
looking for supports that like have like good trigger pool, and this was something that both Chime and Poome were on my list of okay, I'd be happy to have these supports on next when we were building the next roster, so they were really close in the running. So I think that like this is an exciting bot lane to see from that perspective. Uh, Generally speaking, Tally isn't someone, for example, who I've had a lot of positive thoughts about when I've seen him play. Obviously, he swapped to mid recently, right? And his mid play was, I won't say atrocious because that's not fair, but it wasn't great, So I'm glad he's back to top. That's very exciting for him. I think he did really well considering that he had to swap sort of to make the roster work.
Yeah.
But I'm glad he's back to top. I still don't think he's going to be the highlight of this team. So I'd rather see it be like the conversation more be about jungle and bot. I think Yumbi can be pretty good actually. Yumbi really impressed me at Scouting Grounds and when I was doing scouting leading up to Scouting Grounds. He has pretty good visualization for fights and how he's thinking about the game. He's very capable of kind of saying, when I have a lead, this is how I'm going to tell the team to play around me, which is
Mm.
really good for a rookie. So there's a lot of exciting pieces about this Golden Guardian roster. I'm assuming that we won't get to see these teams right off the bat because a lot of them will have issues with imports,
Yeah.
getting visas, but like all of these, I mean, Academy is always plagued by import issues just because
Yeah.
P1 visas are hard to get for these teams. But yeah, Golden Guardians Academy is a team that I like a lot more. So if you compare my excitement about Golden Guardians Academy to my excitement about Dig Academy, when they both have similar kind of strategies for their LCS lineup, the Golden Guardians is just really an org that says, all bets are off. We have no money. Uh, we're just
Yeah.
doubling down on taking risks. I have a lot of kind of issues with their approach on the LCS side, but I think this is a really solid academy roster, just irrespective of how they're running their LCS team.
Yeah, I think, and obviously there's a lot to be said about what Golden Guardians are doing, and they're very much leaning into that narrative of, hey, we're doing a rebuild, we're gonna try to get some young players up and develop them and so on, or at least some new players, even if they aren't technically 16, 17 year olds, whatever it is that you consider a young player. If you have you thought of a project that I have to do soon,
Mm-hmm.
now that we actually know all the rosters, is Academy Power Rankings, and probably I'll balance that off with like, not because winning Academy isn't necessarily the number one goal or the only goal, at least. And so I'm going to have to talk a little bit about
Mm-hmm.
who do I think is going to win Academy, but also who do I think did the best job and is going to like succeed the most in terms of like developing players and so on. But just in the sense of like who's going to win Academy, have you come up with who you think is going to be the top team or top couple of teams based on the lineups we have?
So I think by the end of the year, 100 Thieves Academy will be the best roster.
Yeah.
Um, I think Tenacity and Kenby are really, really talented, but they aren't quite at the level where they're going to be like destroying their academy level opponents yet. So there's that factor to consider. But by the end of the year, I think that you can say that they will be. In terms of Cloud9 Academy, I know a lot of people are looking at this team, but I think Fire is like really hit or miss, right? And like he has kind of a little, in terms of how he's playing the game. I think he can command players to play to what he visualizes well, but it's also a very narrow way that he visualizes how to play. But that can be good when you have a rookie mid like Copy.
Mhm.
I think Copy is not as demanding in terms of like those types of resources and what he wants to execute. So having someone like Fire can be really good for him.
Mhm.
But I think that like Cloud9 are still in a pretty good position to do well early on in the academy splits. Let's see if there are
Yeah, I
any
think
kind of
a couple of the
sleeper
teams that
that I
maybe
can.
could compete those, like TSM might be one of them. Maybe you might stretch to
I
include.
think Babbitt. I
Yeah.
think having a less solid jungler in this meta, like less mechanically solid and less just in terms of pathing and visualization, is not a good idea.
Mm.
Then, so I think that will hold them back unless they change the way jungle works. So the fact that they have Babip on their team is the biggest question mark for me. I think obviously people are going to look at Hanser or Cody-san and be like, okay, these are LCS caliber players, but Babip for me is the biggest question mark. And people don't like. I think King and Luger are also like LCS caliber ADs, potentially better than Cody. Um, right, and
Yeah.
then you have right. So this is like the biggest thing for me. Honestly, I don't know as much. I'm assuming Yursan is starting, but Fizzy is going to be in until he gets a visa.
Yeah.
So I know like less about your son, right? But then this like I feel like both of these both C9 and 100 bloodlines are better. Let's
Yeah.
see.
No, I think so too. In
Um,
in terms of the bot lane specifically, like King is a player who I think definitely could be playing in LCS. I think there are some split opinions on who's better between King and Lost, for example, and Lost is going to be starting with TSM, and I feel good about
Lost is
that.
better, but
So,
I'm
uh,
very confident in saying the Lost is better. But yes, go ahead.
but even with that level of confidence, even with that level of confidence, King is pretty good, right? In terms of the
King
100
has good
Thieves bot lane,
laning.
then sorry, yeah,
King has good laning. He's bad at kind of like modulating. He's bad at kind of stopping bleeding, and then he's also bad at like sometimes his execution in fights with his leads is not as good as Lost. So that's Lost also has like more of the both of them have like a very kind of aggressive style of playing the game, but I think it works out more for Lost than King. Um,
sure.
so that's kind of where I am on that.
But in terms
Good.
of the bot lanes overall, so between King and Isles, and then Luger and Poome, who do you
Yep.
think is the stronger facet there? Maybe tell us a little bit more about Luger because he's a player that I haven't had the
Yep.
chance to kind of learn about yet.
So Luger is when we did scouting for 100 Thieves. Luger was someone who definitely really stood out as like he is a very mechanically talented AD. We thought that he was LCS level already, right? But he lanes well. He plays fights well. Yeah, there's not a whole lot else to say about that. I think maybe he's better than King. I haven't actually thought about it that much, and I'd want to do a little bit more
Mm.
comparison and rewatch some of King's games before I made a definitive decision in terms of like Luger versus King. But
Yeah.
he's very strong. I think Isles right now is a little bit better than Poom just in terms of how he visualizes situations when he's ahead versus when he's behind, like some of the creative flank angles he does, just the way that he plays out like that. But Poom learns really, really fast, like
Mm.
absurdly fast. I don't know, maybe Isles does too, but I haven't met a player who learns as fast as Poom, honestly.
Nice.
So that's kind of where I am in terms of those spotlights. So right now I would give like a slight edge to the 100 spotlight
Okay.
in terms of like longevity again. But I think immediately probably Cloud9's bot lane will perform a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think like between those two teams, Cloud9 definitely has more of a balance towards players that you're confident are going to win this year versus 100 Thieves, where you have a little more on, I'd say a little more on the side of potential. Tenacity can be Poom. Like these are guys who, by the end of the year, we think they will have leveled up a lot. Whereas the Cloud9, like
Yeah,
Copy, is the only guy really where you're going to be like, he's got a lot of room where we aren't really sure how far he's going to go. And Zion, Spartan, Fire, you know what they are already. King, you know pretty well already. Isles, I think too. So
I think King and Isles have room to improve as well. Like some
Yeah.
of the things that I commented on with like his comparison to Lost, I think that he can definitely kind of grow into. So yeah, I think that their bot side is pretty solid developmental pieces. I think like with 100 Thieves, almost everyone is a developmental piece. So again, like I'm biased in preferring that type of roster. Even yes, even Ryoma, but I know that there's a lot of mixed opinions on Ryoma, but I think he still has a lot of room to like his mechanical ability is still pretty decent, and he has a lot of room to grow as well. So
Cool. Okay, so we've talked through Academy, we've talked through Amateur, we've talked through who we think are the most, interesting players or the best
mm-hmm.
players and teams to watch and pay attention to. What about jumping up to the LCS level? I put out a video the other day about, some reasons if you wanted to argue for TL being the best team in LCS by the end of the year, who's going to win the summer championship and so on. Some reasons why that could be the case. The spoiler alert was that at the end of the video, I decided I had not convinced myself that TL would be first, but I thought C9 would be first still, like I put in my power rankings. So I want to throw out there, first of all, that I said that I thought TL and C9 would be everybody's top two. And then it was
Okay.
just between those two of you for people to decide which one they thought. Is that something you agree with? And if so, and even if not, who would you put as your top teams in the LCS?
So my clear number one is Cloud9, and I think TSM and TL are closer in skill level than TL is to C9. Generally speaking, I also think that by the end of the year, FlyQuest will be in that like mix of three conversation. So that's I guess probably my most controversial take. It's not too controversial, but the reason why I see C9 as just being the clear favorite is because there's not really a big flaw in Fudge's gameplay. He's just a very solid player in almost every regard. Plays almost everything you'd want out of a top laner, and I think that him and Licorice probably are very competitive players individually. So if you like Licorice, probably like Fudge. If you like Fudge, probably like Licorice. And then you have like my biggest question mark around how C9 will play will actually be mid jungle, just because I think that if you see how G2 play, they're very much focused on playing really, really volatile lanes and then making sure their jungler is constantly watching the wave states and responding to what they're doing. And I don't see Blabber playing that way. That's not really Blabber's style. He's more, I'm going to run into the jungle and you're going to follow me up. So I don't see Perks really playing that way. So that's like the biggest question mark. But I think that in general, anytime there's a skirmish around mid, they'll just win it. So uh, even probably if they're playing like disadvantageous mid jungle matchup, they probably can just arm wrestle a lot of it sometimes. So in general, I think that they're just really, really solid. Don't have a lot of points where I would have a question mark around it, unless Parks just comes to like full on vacation, and we get the G2 vacation memes coming back with Parks playing Rise and Azir, etc. Um, but otherwise, I don't really see C9 not placing first. In terms of Team Liquid, right, I have more of a question mark in terms of how Santorin will play if he's required to have Trigger Pull. I think the plus side is that they have a lot of players on their team that have Trigger Pull, which is Jensen, GoreJJ. So like a lot of that burden will be taken up from him. But if you have like a skirmish around mid, a team fight, and this ends up being like and C9 makes the game very volatile, I just don't see them winning that with the way that Santorin is going to play. And then in terms of top lane, I think Alfari is like obviously better than Fudge, but I wouldn't even say like it's too insanely obvious, but I don't think that this is a top lane scenario that will play well with but I think that there was conflict on Origin, for example, between like Alfari and bot lane, and I could see that being a scenario again, just because historically TL is a team that always plays around bot, right? So I just am really curious how they're going to adapt to that scenario. That's probably like a complaint that I have with their roster on the same level as C9's mid jungle question, though. And then I think for TSM, they have a really underrated bot lane just because people don't really know how good Lost is, or they aren't really rating Lost that highly just because Double Lift retired. It might be a too soon scenario for me to say that Lost is an upgrade, but in terms of like how,
I've already gone out and said that I thought Lost was an upgrade. I'm pretty sure
yeah,
I've put that in
okay,
my
cool.
public content. So
Yeah. So like Lost is an upgrade, I think, over Doublelift. Doublelift, just in terms of how Doublelift was playing towards the end of his career. I think that for him, probably he felt that it was a good time to retire, and that was slightly reflected in his play. In terms of their their jungle mid scenario, like that one's also a mismatch. I can see it being like a more extreme mismatch, but I see like a similar number of holes in TSM's lineup to the number of holes in the way TL can play. It just comes down to whether or not you think Sword Art will be a 1v9 support in the same way core JJ is, right? I think that's the biggest thing that you come down to, and I'm more of the opinion that he can be that player. So that's why I place them on a similar level.
yeah, so you think I think if Sword Art plays even touching distance of Core JJ's level that he's contributed, I think that will be a pretty big deal in a positive way for TSM. And I think people who are down on TSM, and I agree with you in this that I put them third in my power rankings, and I think that I agree that the gap between 2 and 3 is closer than 2 and 1 in C9TL TSM. But I think a lot of people look at Huni in the top lane and say, "Oh, this guy's terrible and he's washed up and he's garbage." And I've come out kind of defending him and done some VOD review on him and stuff like that, in the sense that I don't come in and say Huni is still as good as someday or something like that. Like he's not, but he's at least assuming that he's mentally committed to it, which is a question you could maybe have a little bit. But he's at least gonna be serviceable and maybe a little better than average, which is all I think you really need given what the rest of the roster has on them.
So I actually, when I was doing my Huni related VOD review, I actually came away feeling way worse about it. So I just think his concept of like what he's supposed to be doing in his lane just on an individual matchup basis is really flawed. He just kind of plays really, really in the face of the top laner, doesn't care about the jungler or just actually throws leads 1v1 by playing incorrectly and just shoving the wave when he doesn't need to, or like using up his like mono resources, etc., and not recalling on a good timer. Like just a bunch of really weird fundamental errors that he made on, and even not just in Academy, which I was already kind of low on, but in LCS, I think what he does give is a clear win condition. But I also feel like Fudge gives that, Alfara gives that. So like I understand why people are skeptical of TSM from the Huni perspective, but I just think that I'm slightly more skeptical of like the core of TL being the jungle, or the core of any team being the jungle, in the kind of meta that we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah, I think on the Huni front also it depends which set of games you watch for sure, because there were quite a few, like definitely right off everything he did in Academy, that was all terrible. I think Spring Split was pretty bad overall. It really was like, and maybe I was cherry picking a little bit. Just the very end of the season, I thought he was, uh, in some cases, not to say he played perfectly all the time, but he was often a victim of the rest of his team being pretty bad. Um, but
I
that
watched the C9 series as well, and that was like one of the biggest ones in terms that stood out to me of him, because I know like he played a lot of roams well, but he just to me like wasn't executing the win condition as well as Licorice, wasn't understanding lane fundamentals as well as Licorice. This was also the FlyQuest series, I think, that stands out to me as well, because I wanted to make a comparison between TSM and FlyQuest when I did my FlyQuest video. So I was reviewing Kuni a lot and then reviewing Licorice a lot.
yeah, and I think definitely I would still agree that Licorice is better than Huni right now for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So if
Yeah.
so, you think FlyQuest has the potential to play themselves into that conversation by the end of the year? I
Yeah.
think there are
Mm-hmm.
a couple other teams that you could have higher or lower levels of confidence on and how they might be able to develop. But overall, how do you feel about the top end of LCS and their potential to be at least reasonably competitive with the rest of the world by the end of the year compared to what we had in 2020? Do you think the LCS has improved?
No. Maybe a little bit better, honestly. Um, I think that Perks coming over has the opportunity to elevate, but I also think that Perks' main goal is probably going to be getting a good, putting himself in a good position to go back to LEC. So I think that that'll be his main goal rather than elevating NA. I think that so you can maybe learn some things from how he's playing, but I don't even think that the way Perks was playing, and obviously he was playing AD, so it's hard to gauge, but I don't even think the way that he was playing demonstrated that he had a really, really solid concept of how to play in the context of the existing metagame. Early game for G2 was always really poor. Obviously, this is in the context of the top teams in the world, right? Not in the context of NA teams. So I think they'll probably still be very, very solid in a North American context. There's a lot of mid-game stuff that he probably had a big say in that can come to NA or that maybe teams can learn from. But I always feel like, you know, there's a European that comes over or someone who works from Europe and comes over and says, we're going to teach North American teams good macro, and it just doesn't happen. I think it just ultimately comes down to what a lot of the existing veteran players are comfortable with executing and how, like, when you get into the middle of the game, it just all falls apart and they default to, okay, we're going to push out mid or we're going to face check with jungle into river. We're not going to set up well ahead of time. We're going to put our vision in this spot, which was good 3 years ago, but isn't good anymore. And then, of course, like a lot of the laney stuff, maybe that gets. I think the laney thing is the biggest level up that I can see because I do a lot of kind of coaching in amateur, and even the foundation of it is getting better right now. Like players who were in amateur a year ago know way less than players in amateur now. So I think that, like, in terms of the ability to play lanes well, play like these types of fundamentals well on an international stage, then we'll see like better early games coming out of NA, maybe. But right now, I'm not too optimistic that this is going to make them really, really internationally competitive, or that these rosters will be more internationally competitive than the rosters were this year.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think, I'm probably a bit more of an optimistic person, or at least maybe I intentionally try to be. And I do feel a little better about LCS, and I'm hopeful, but it's a long time between now and October. So we'll see what happens. We'll see whether we get more evidence that things actually are improving. I think at the very least we should get some pretty good battles domestically to see who's going to win out in the LCS. And I'm hopeful that, what we get in Academy and what we get in the amateur tournaments gives us a lot of things to be excited about this year. And so, we've got, like we said off the top of the show, we've got Risen this weekend. Watch that first amateur tournament. Start to see who we can cheer for and what's going to happen. And it should be a fun year. And I hope that we'll be able to have you back, throughout the year at different points to see how it's going, to diagnose, maybe look around the rest of the world a little bit too.
Yep.
And I'm sure people will have a lot of content that, they're going to be able to get from you also directly. So just to kind of round us off here, you are switching back into kind of more content creation mode yourself. Where are people going to be able to kind of find that content as you work on it throughout the year?
Yeah, so right now the best place to find my stuff is the YouTube channel. KARONMOSER is the YouTube, same as my Twitter. You can also find it via my Twitter. I just released a video on Invictus Gaming earlier today. So you can check that out if you like LPL content. Obviously, we didn't talk about LPL at all, but they have a cool rookie jungler on Invictus Gaming, and just the idea of like what that will do for the team. I'll probably do a lot more LCS and NA related content coming this week. I want to do a lot of stuff covering Risen at least. Yep, and if you're interested in North America LPL, check out my YouTube channel.
Awesome. And I'll make sure that links to that are in the show notes. So if you're listening or watching later, you can check those out and make sure to follow Kelsey's work. So thanks for joining on the show today, Kelsey. And for everyone listening, you can support the True Sight podcast at patreon.com/oracleselixir. You can subscribe on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms, or check all of those links out at anchor.fm/TrueSight. And make sure you check out the Oracle's Elixir Discord server to talk about League of Legends esports, data science, and a lot of other topics. This has been the True Sight podcast with Kelsey Moser, and I'm Tim Sevenhuisen. Thanks for listening.